The Factorio expansion, Space Age, is coming on October the 21st, and we know almost nothing about its combat. And that sounds like another opportunity for me to speculate wildly. Welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be talking about new weapons and combat mechanics that we might get in Space Age. Current weapons. Before we can talk about what weapons might be added in Space Age, I think it's worth analysing and reviewing what weapons we have now. That way, we can see where there are gaps that new weapons, or changes to existing weapons, might fill. If you prefer just to skip ahead to my speculations about new things for Space Age, you can use the timeline or the timestamps in the description below. There are a lot of weapons already in the game, but I think we can boil them down into different categories and types, with each specific weapon then combining one or more of these. I'm going to group the weapons as follows. Firstly, weapon classes. How is the effect delivered? Secondly, ammunition types. All weapons use ammunition, but there are differences in the way they work. Thirdly, damage types. What effect does the weapon or ammunition apply to the target? Existing weapon classes. First, we have the delivery mechanism. That is, how is the effect delivered on target? Here, I'm defining 4 different classes of weapon. These are guns, throwables, turrets, and defensive systems. Let's look at each of these more closely. Guns. These are the weapons that the engineer has put into their weapon slot, which represents holding the weapon to use. This category currently includes the pistol, the submachine gun, the shotgun, the combat shotgun, the flamethrower, and the rocket launcher. Throwables. Throwables are any weapon the engineer has to manually deploy at a distance. That is, they involve the player holding the item in their cursor and clicking on the terrain to throw the item. There are 2 subtypes here, passive weapons and active weapons, but I'm going to think of those as more like ammunition types. Indeed, we'll discuss this whole category more when we talk about ammunition, but throwables fall into a few groups. Grenades, capsules, which are similar to grenades but they have different effects, and combat robots. Here, there's several different types, which I'll talk about later, as I say. Turrets, or perhaps more accurately, fixed emplacements. These can also be thought of as defensive systems, but because they actively attack enemies and can be used to clear out nests, indeed that is what they're mostly used for in the game, I'm going to think of them as a specific weapon class. All turrets require some form of ammunition to function, and they all auto-target. The 4 we have in the game are gun turrets, available almost from the beginning of the game, laser turrets, which are available relatively early and are perhaps the most easiest to use if you have the power, flamethrower turrets. Many consider these to be overpowered with their high damage against everything, especially as they gain huge bonuses from multiple damage researches, and artillery. This is our only long-range weapon solution at the moment. Defensive systems. I'm going to lump all of the defensive systems together into one class, as it's simpler, but it's debatable whether these should actually be broken down a little bit differently. They are walls and gates, or more generally barriers. The engineer can put down walls which act as a barrier to mobile land-based enemies. These enemies must first destroy the walls before they can move on. Walls therefore predominantly act as a delaying mechanism to give other weapons, such as turrets, the time to attack. Landmines, or, more generally, traps. Here, the weapon must be placed in a fixed location and an enemy must trigger it for it to have an effect. We only have one weapon of this type at the moment, the landmine. Landmines do enough damage to kill small and medium biters, but also stun bigger biters in an area around them. The stun stops the biters and gives other weapons time to attack and kill them. Slowdown capsules. I've noticed slowdown capsules separately, but they do fill a very similar role to landmines. Unlike landmines, however, they do no actual damage, but they do stun, or in this case slow down, the biters. Slowdown capsules can only be deployed by the player, and the use cases for slowdown capsules are actually quite limited. They can delay the biters to allow the player to escape, or can simply be used to slow them so that other weapons have more time to attack and kill the biters. Armour. The player can also equip various types of armour, both passive and active, with the latter having an equipment grid that can be filled with useful offensive and defensive equipment. Shields. Shields are an equipment grid item, which means they can be used by the player or a Spidertron. In operation, the shield essentially absorbs damage before the player. However, shields must be charged by the player's equipment grid, so they effectively turn electricity into a second health bar. They do nothing to counter slowdown effects on the player or Spidertron. Discharge defense. This is a bit of a weird system, as it is a massive shock attack that kills and stuns enemies in a short range around where it is deployed. Uniquely, I believe, it also pushes enemies back, the idea being that it gives the player some breathing room. It can only be put in the player's equipment grid, but it is then used like a grenade or capsule using a remote. It therefore sits in an odd position, as it is quite powerful but takes up valuable equipment grid space and is, in my opinion, somewhat fiddly to use, given you operate it in a similar way to the throwables. If it were automatically deployed, then I think it would be more widely used. Okay, so the reason I've lumped all of these together is that overall we can see that purely defensive systems are a little underrepresented in the game, as it assumes that the player will either be attacking biters directly or will be using the more offensive weapons as a mainstay of their defensive approach. That is, defensive systems are mostly intended to be used in conjunction with offensive systems. I don't think this will change too much in Space Age, but I'll highlight some ideas as we go. A note on personal equipment. I do think that maybe we will get a few things related to power armour and personal equipment in Space Age. In particular, we saw this strange arm that I believe relates to a new power armour or similar. However, I'm not going to talk about this more than I have in previous videos, and for personal equipment, I'm just going to note two things. Firstly, as well as the shields, a mobile laser turret can be equipped, but it functions pretty much how you'd imagine a laser you carry around. We may get something similar related to other weapons, but to me, these are more like variants, and I'm not going to talk too much about the more obvious variants. Secondly, the Spidertron is currently the only vehicle able to equip personal items. Spidertron in function is close to being a remote player avatar, as it can undertake most of the same functions, building and combat, that the player typically does in person. Therefore, any new player personal equipment grid weapon is also likely to be deployable on Spidertron. Alternatively, it could be built by bots that the Spidertron deploys. My other reason for not really discussing defensive systems is that generally this aspect does not seem to be a strong focus for the game. The player and Spidertron are the only ones with equipment grids, and they can be quite overpowered already. Adding new things would therefore seem to be a little redundant, and besides, I think the big change here is going to be quality. We know that higher quality personal armour and Spidertrons will have bigger equipment grids, allowing you to double down on what you already have. That is, if you're already powerful with 3 lasers and 2 shields, imagine how powerful you will be with 6 lasers and 4 shields. Then imagine how powerful you'll be with the level 5 quality. Plus, since the potential changes are perhaps obvious, a personal grenade launcher or other throwable launcher, personal rocket turret, a personal flamethrower, etc., etc., like I say, please take it as read that anything I say about new weapons or ammo could also have a personal equipment version. A note on vehicles. Like personal equipment, I'm not going to distinguish between vehicle-mounted and player-deployed weapons. Obviously, each vehicle comes with one or more of its own weapon systems. However, the overlaps with the player's weapon systems is such that I don't feel it's worth distinguishing between these. As with personal equipment, they're more like variants, and I don't think it's worth spending too much time on variants as separate things in this video. However, there is one case that's probably worth discussing, which is the tank. Unlike the other vehicles, this has multiple inbuilt weapon systems, and is, I would therefore argue, the only vehicle specifically designed for combat. Note that obviously you can deploy lasers and shields on a Spidertron, but a Spidertron's only organic weapon system is the missile launcher. A tank has a gun, which is the same as the player's, a flamethrower turret, and a cannon. Interestingly, the tank's flamethrower works differently to the other 2 flamethrowers in the game, in that it is more like a burner than a napalm launcher like the other 2. Note that I'll discuss this aspect more later when I talk about ammunition. The tank's cannon is a weapon exclusive to the tank, as no other weapon system can deploy it. However, cannon shells are a part of artillery shells, so they do get upgraded in that way. If we're looking for gaps, then cannons seem like a pretty big one. Existing ammunition types. Ammunition is anything that gets consumed when a weapon system is used. That is, unlike a gun or a turret, you end up with less of them after using them. I'm going to group these into 3 types, though these are a bit fuzzy. Firstly, rounds. Secondly, fuel. And thirdly, consumables. Rounds. I know this naming is a little odd, but I'm going to try to make a distinction between the different ways ammunition works in the game. For rounds, I'm thinking about those types of ammunition that you must craft, you must load into one of the weapon classes to use, and that, for reasons that will hopefully become apparent, do not involve the inexhaustible resources. The first ammunition that falls into this category of rounds are bullets. Bullets. Here we currently have 3 variants of basic bullets, which represent an upgrade path. Note that upgrades are a common factor for most ammunition types. Firstly, we have normal rounds, which are actually called firearm magazines in the game. These are actually very weak and are really only effective against small biters. The lesson for players is to either use buffs to make them more effective, or, more importantly, that things can be upgraded, in this case to the piercing rounds. Piercing rounds, which are piercing rounds magazine in the game. For all but the end game, piercing ammo is a good, effective, reliable ammunition type. Note also that these are used in the military science pack to encourage you to produce them. Uranium rounds, called uranium rounds magazines in the game. An ideal use for all that spare U-238 you've got lying around. Another common theme with several ammunition types is that if they're used in a weapon, each individual instance has multiple charges. That is, the player actually produces magazines of bullets which hold a given number of rounds. Rounds are then fired individually, but you don't need to produce bullets and the game auto-manages magazine contents. This ensures a good level of damage from a single craft without ridiculous item stacks or overfilling the player's inventory with half-empty magazines. Another common abstraction in the game is that weapons can take the same ammunition where, in real life, these would likely be different. So a pistol and the gun turret can take the same ammunition as the submachine gun, where, even if these weapons had the same caliber, in real life they'd likely have different loading mechanisms. That is, there'd be a different magazine shape for the pistol and submachine gun, due to the different form factors, and ammo would likely be belt-fed for the gun turret, which looks like a minigun. Shotgun shells. I'm not going to talk about these in any depth, as they're basically just bullets for the shotguns. There's 2 types, normal and piercing, which do have different damages. And shotgun shells do have some unique mechanics, such as the cone-shaped area of effect and the slowdown they apply to the player. But other than that, they're very similar to bullets. Note that there's no turret that uses shotgun shells at the moment. Rockets, or missiles. Firstly, just a little note that I think the naming convention here is a little unfortunate, as it's a bit wonky and easily confused with the rockets you launch into space, for example. So I'm going to use the term missiles as a substitute. Like other ammunition types, these progress through a set of upgrades. Firstly, we have the missile. These have good range and damage, but are a little slow firing. Then we have explosive missiles. This is a missile with some explosives strapped to it, so that it does splash damage, hurting enemies in an area around the initial impact. It's great for taking out large groups, but prone to friendly fire. Finally, we have the atomic bomb, or rather the atomic missile. Like I say, the naming convention is a little wonky. Got some spare fissile material lying around? Well, why not use it to make the biter's day worse? This missile has a huge area of effect and, to accommodate this, actually boosts the missile launcher's range to help you survive. Until the announcement of the introduction of the missile turret, missiles could only be deployed by the rocket or Spidertron. The Spidertron actually has a special 4-tube launcher that allows for a much higher rate of fire, making them a much more viable weapon system to use. Cannon shells. Again, we have a lot of different variants of the cannon shells, but, uniquely, they can only be fired by the tank's cannon. Cannon shell, the basic cannon shell. If you can be bothered to make them, I find the recipe a little complex for the stage of the game it's used in. These are very effective, especially as you're in a tank, so you are well protected and can move and shoot. Explosive cannon shell. Again, these now involve explosives, but, interestingly, unlike other ammo that has an explosive version, you produce them with a completely separate crafting recipe, rather than upgrading the normal shell. Again, we have a different approach, and the fact that this is used in only one vehicle, and there are some odd balancing with biter resistances, means there are, I feel, quite a few blockers to using them. Since you can't simply upgrade what you've got, and it may not work as well, why faff about making and using both? Uranium cannon shell. Weirdly, this is an upgraded version of the normal cannon shell. You strap some U-235 to your cannon shell and it doubles the effectiveness of the normal shell. Explosive uranium cannon shells. And this is the upgrade path for the explosive cannon shell, and it's also one of the biggest disappointments. The improvements it gets don't really represent a huge gain over the explosive cannon shells, and it almost feels like it's just there to fill the gap in the list. However, whatever you might think about them, generally, making explosive cannon shells is necessary if you want to deploy artillery. Artillery shells. Artillery shells come in only one flavour and are expensive as they use 4 explosive shells, but their range far outstrips anything else we have. Their 2 main uses are 1. To quickly clear out a new area that you want to exploit and build on, and 2. For keeping biters from recolonising around your base. Oddly, artillery actually struggles to kill the largest biters, but they can single-shot all biter nests and all worms. Fuel. Okay, I know this may seem like a weird way of looking at it, but the first fuel is electricity. Electricity is, in effect, the ammunition type for lasers and the discharge defence. It must be produced and is consumed when the weapon is used. However, it is usually not produced just for this purpose. Electricity is also the fuel for the shield. Oil-based fuels. I'm also using fuel as a generic name for the ammunition for the various types of flamethrowers in the game. As noted before, there are 3 different types of flamethrower in the game. Firstly, there's the personal flamethrower, which I'm classifying as a gun. This requires unprocessed oil. It essentially shoots a jet of flaming napalm that sets things on fire. It worths some flammen, in other words, and it also leaves a patch of burning fuel on the ground. The second flamethrower is the turret variant. In operation, this is the same as the personal flamethrower, shooting a jet of flaming napalm. However, it can take heavy oil and light oil as fuel, as well as basic oil, gaining a slight damage buff from both. It has a limited firing arc and a minimum range, meaning it can't hit biters close to it, but it is a very powerful system. The last flamethrower is mounted on the tank. This takes exactly the same canister-based fuel as the personal flamethrower, but acts more like a burner you might see on a grill. That is, the jet of fire it shoots out only damages things in front of it by dealing direct damage. It doesn't actually set things on fire. I'll be frank, the complexity of this area of the game is therefore surprisingly high. Having multiple different oil-based fuel types that do slightly different things depending on how they are deployed is probably complex enough already. So I suspect there will be no real changes for Space Age. If we do get new fuels that flamethrowers can use, they will likely result in new or different damage effects, which I'll discuss later, but the point here is that they would be consumed as ammunition just like the current fuels. Consumables. For the thrown weapons, the ammunition is also the weapon itself, and, in each example, the item is consumed like it was ammunition. That is, it is not an infinite resource, it takes up separate inventory space, but it doesn't need to be loaded into anything to be used. Here we have 2 basic types. Firstly, grenades. These are the first area of effect weapon you are likely to unlock and are required in the military research to encourage you to make and use them. While highly effective against biters, many players, including me, also use them to clear trees. That's one heck of a grenade. Cluster grenades. These are a little different to other explosive upgrade types, as you actually strap multiple regular grenades together, and when you deploy them, this parcel breaks apart, launching 7 separate grenades in different directions. In other words, it's like throwing 7 grenades at the same time in a large radius. This makes them highly effective at clearing big areas, but it also makes them highly prone to friendly fire damage. The demo video on the wiki even shows the player being hit. While, as we mentioned, the game does have explosives, these cannot actually be deployed in the same way as grenades or other consumables. To be used for military purposes, they must be combined in a crafting recipe and, generally, produce an explosive version of the existing ammunition, as we've already seen. Capsules. Capsules come in a range of flavours, applying unique and different effects. They are called capsules to help distinguish them from grenades, but the way they are deployed is basically the same, thrown by the player, and only the player. Interestingly, the capsules do not benefit from many buffs. There are 5 different capsules in the game. Slowdown capsules, which I've already discussed as a defensive system, poison capsules, and then 3 flavours of combat robots. Poison capsules are interesting, as they don't actually affect nests or the player's structures and vehicles. This makes them sit across the boundaries I've created between offensive and defensive systems, as, generally, you will need other weapons to take out nests if you're on the offensive. However, poison capsules are therefore quite good at crowd control when using the tank to take out nests. However, you can't deploy them automatically, so they're useless for something like wall defense, where it would be handy to have some sort of poison cloud to deploy. Combat robots. The 3 types of combat robots are distinct, but in manufacture they work like an upgrade path. Like bullets, for example, the basic level 1 drones are upgraded into level 2 drones, and then these are upgraded into level 3 drones. These levels are 1. The Defender capsule, 2. The Distractor capsule, and 3. The Destroyer capsule. These names do imply different use cases, and there are subtle differences involved. In particular, the Distractor holds position while the other 2 follow the player. There are also changes in weapons. The Defender has a gun, the Distractor has a laser, and the Destroyer has something akin to a discharge defense. The number of drones deployed in each capsule also increases with each level, from 1 to 3 to 5. Things like health, shooting speed and lifespan do change, though not in a simple upgrade way. So, Destroyers, the level 3 drone, actually have less health than Distractors, the level 2 drone, for example. You do, therefore, have the potential here for some fairly complex tactics and strategies, and that's kind of the problem with them. For example, the follow mechanic, where the bots have inertia so you can slingshot them into biters, is actually fairly unintuitive, and in the panic of being attacked, it's difficult to use without practice. The fact everything has quite short ranges also makes them feel quite limited. When you add to this that they're quite complex and expensive to produce, especially as you're guaranteed to lose them since they are a consumable, I think most players just don't bother with them. But it has to be said that a huge swarm of combat robots is actually very effective. However, I do think this is a bit of an underdeveloped area of the game. It's a nice idea that never really got refined to the point where it is as useful as the other solutions we have. Existing damage types. There are several damage types in the game, and these are associated with resistances. These are, taken from the wiki, physical, covering bullets, shotgun shells, defender robots and biters. Impact collision, that is getting hit by a train, a car or a tank. This is actually a pretty effective tactic, especially for the tank. Fire, for the flamethrowers. Acid, which is for worms and spitters. Poison, which is just the poison capsule. Explosion, which covers missiles, grenades, artillery shells and landmines. Laser, which is the laser turrets, distractor robots and personal laser defense. And electric, which covers the discharge defense and destroyer robots. Note that biters do physical damage and spitters and worms do acid damage, and while the player is also able to do physical damage, we cannot deal acid damage. Our equivalent to the spit from the worms and spitters is a combination of poison and slowdown, 2 separate ammunition types. I have to say, this feels like one of the least well developed aspects of the game. It's there, and it's involved in the calculations, but the player's interaction with it is fairly simple. I think this is because the biters don't really come in multiple flavours, yet. By this I mean that there aren't specialist biters in the base game. There's no biter variant that deals fire damage, and there's no biter variant that's super resistant to lasers, for example. So, if we factor in the buffs and upgrades for ammunition, the player can basically use whatever weapon system they like. It does push us more towards a mixed arms approach. This means that having all 3 turrets will deal different damage types, improving the overall effectiveness of your defensive emplacements. However, the flamethrower turrets are a little overpowered because they gain from multiple buffs that stack, and their ammo, fuel, is an unlimited resource. This general effectiveness of all weapons is clearly deliberate to avoid restricting the player from playing how they want, but it does render this whole part of the game a little redundant. I actually think we'll see more damage types and resistances added to the game in Space Age, and there may then be a rock, paper, scissors aspect added to the combat, but I'll talk about both of those later and in my enemies video. Note on resistances. I'm not going to go into how damage resistances work, but I do think this might be an area where either new things could be introduced or tweaks could be made in Space Age. For example, new power armor or new shield types or new vehicles could all give different resistances. These could also be traded off against each other. This armor is good against this type of damage but weak against another, for example. The problem with this is that it's a relatively complex system to understand. There'd need to be tutorials and better tooltips to make it a viable thing to play with, and I think it's just not what the game is about. This isn't an RPG after all, so min-maxing builds isn't really a thing. I think this sort of change might end up feeling more like a distraction than an improvement. I do think there's one area of a Space Age where this might become particularly important though, and that's asteroids, but we'll talk about them in the enemies video. Note on buffs. Another thing I'm not really going to talk about, but are obvious candidates for extension or more options in Space Age, is that there are several buffs in the game. That is, there are technologies you can research that improve an aspect of one or more weapon classes or damage types. For example, physical projectiles and energy weapons both get 2 buffs, shooting speed, which is capped at 6 improvements, and damage, which is infinite, but the cost quickly grows beyond the value of researching more levels. However, buffs do not have a single universal approach, so explosives and fire effects only get a damage buff, as shooting speed generally makes less sense for this ammunition type. Or, as another example, artillery gets a shooting speed buff as well as range improvements. There's no damage increase you can research, as the primary use of artillery is for clearing nests and worms, which they can one-shot at their base power. However, this does mean that they are never able to one-shot behemoth biters, for example. The number of combat robots the player can deploy can also be increased. This is a weird one, as it is the only infinite science in the game that uses every single science pack. However, it is problematic for a megabase science because it only has a 30-second cycle time. It is also inherently redundant, as combat robots have a lifetime, and so you eventually reach a point where you cannot easily deploy them faster than they are destroyed. Technically, you can deploy a lot before this happens, but this requires concerted effort, and the 100 deployed combat robots achievement can actually be a difficult thing to hit because of this attrition effect. Anyway, as with some of the other areas that I'm not going to discuss in detail, more buffs are fairly obvious, either ones related to any new weapon systems, or improving other effects not already covered by existing buffs. For example, a lifetime duration buff for combat robots could be added to work in concert with the existing deployment buff. As noted before, capsules don't currently have buffs, so you could imagine poison damage and slowdown getting buffs. However, as noted, with the limited usage of these, having new buffs probably isn't worth it, unless there's something to encourage you to use them more in the game. What this all means. I'll be using these groupings that we've just been discussing in the rest of the video to identify new areas where I think there will be combat additions, and of course there'll be a quiz later, but to give you some examples. The machine gun. Weapon class. Gun. The engineer holds it to use it. Ammunition type. Rounds. Bullets in this case. Damage type. Physical. And, as noted above, the car and tank both have machine guns, but I won't be looking at this sort of distinction. I suspect there will be new vehicles in Space Age, but I won't be covering those in this video either. Some more examples. Walls. Weapon class. Defensive system. Ammunition type. None. Damage type. None. Flamethrower turret. Weapon class. Turret, or fixed emplacement. Ammunition type. Fuel. Damage type. Fire. You get the idea. New weapons. Firstly, welcome if you skipped ahead. Note that I'm not going to re-explain the concepts I just covered, so if things get confusing, please use the timestamps below to look things up. Okay, so let's think about new combat options for Space Age, starting with the things we know for sure. The missile turret. We already know from Friday Frax 410 that Wooby will be introducing a missile turret, which fills a gap. I'm not going to talk about it here since I did a whole Friday Facts video about it, but it does reveal a few things that I think hint that maybe Wooby is looking at combat changes more than simply adding 1 or 2 new turrets. Firstly, the missile turret is not unlocked on Nauvis, but one of the 3 intermediate planets. Could we perhaps get 1 new turret per planet? Second, it is bigger than existing turrets at 3x3 and has a different coverage area with quite a large minimum range. This suggests they are open to different options for buildings. Thirdly, it has a greater effectiveness against larger asteroids. This could relate to damage types, or it could be a new enemy and weapon class damage modifier. Fourth, they've reduced the cost of its basic ammunition, suggesting they're not averse to tweaking current combat options. And that Friday Facts also talked about some more general tweaks. These are that they've introduced turret priorities and filtering, as well as the ability to link turrets to the circuit network. To me, all this combined suggests that we are open to introducing new systems and approaches for combat. A cannon turret and a shotgun turret? As per the analysis in the first part of this video, we have some notable omissions, and these include weapon and ammo types that don't have turret equivalents. The two big ones are shotguns and the cannon. Both are therefore sort of dead ends and are exclusively locked to one mode of operation. The shotgun can only be used by the player, it has no use on vehicles and has no turret, and the cannon can only be used in a tank, not by the player, not by a turret, and not even on another vehicle. As such, I think both are fairly obvious candidates for a similar new turret to the missile launcher. Both are also commonly added in mods, usually providing a short-range, high-damage but limited direction turret for shotguns, and an intermediate-range turret for the cannon. However, I'm not actually sure either of these will be added. The shotgun turret seems unnecessary given the regular gun turret, and the missile launcher is quite close to fulfilling the potential role that a cannon turret would. If only one of these is added, I think the cannon turret is most likely, since it could maybe be used at a much longer range than the missiles and would possibly give some interesting options around using the different types of ammo it has. But even here, it feels like the missile turret is just intended to fill this role. Launchables, but not the Dairy Lee ones. Now technically this is more like a mix of the existing classes, particularly throwables and turrets, but I'd like to be able to equip in a personal equipment grid, and therefore on Spidertron as well, and possibly place as a turret something that can automatically throw the various throwable weapons. I think actually to give this a more proper name, it would be a mortar, something that's able to launch things over a medium to short range. I think introducing something like this would make these weapons far more relevant and useful throughout the game. Now don't get me wrong, I appreciate that it's a design decision by the devs to make it so that combat becomes trivial in late game. You can research buffs and produce huge amounts of everything, so your walls become impregnable. You can also use Spidertrons and artillery to easily delete the bugs remotely. But my problem is that this removes choice. If I want to use combat robots to defend my walls, I can't. If I want to try to use slowdown capsules and gun turrets alone, so no walls nor anything else, just them, then I can't. It could even extend to landmines, letting me place minefields automatically. Where are these choices for how I want to play? As I'll discuss in the biter video, I think new biter types might introduce a bit of variety, so it would be nice to have new ways of using more of the existing weapons too. However, I don't think we'll get this because we'd need more than simply the mortar to make it work. For example, most of the capsules and grenades are area of effect weapons, so you'd be very likely to damage your own stuff through friendly fire. And a one-size-fits-all solution involving the coverage area just doesn't work. For example, a limited fire arc and a long minimum range would work for those weapons that might cause collateral damage. But what about something like poison and slowdown capsules that are safe to deploy around your own stuff? And you probably want to use those as relatively short-range defensive systems to protect against bugs that got too close to your walls. The combat robots, they have lifetimes and deployment limits, so how would you manage that? If it simply starts firing out capsules when the biters are in range, you could deploy dozens of bots unnecessarily, especially if the groups got taken out by your lasers before they even became an actual threat. And it'd be cool if a Spidertron could fire out a bunch of defender capsules, but how many does it deploy? What does it trigger on? Again, there's no point spamming out 100 bots because there's a small worm just over there. It would get very expensive for very limited benefit. Long-range drones. At the moment, the only combat drones are the ones deployed in capsules, which makes them very short range. We also have a bit of a gap in that we have a very long range turret, the artillery, and then a whole bunch of short range turrets. I think that this proposal could be an alternative to the mortar idea and could involve a specific new vehicle in the form of some sort of remotely controlled deployment drone. My idea is for a medium-range combat plane or helicopter or hovering platform that can be deployed at a reasonably long range and is under the player's control. You can give it directions and it flies around, and you can specifically tell it to deploy its weapons payload in a specific area. It could perhaps also have an equipment grid that you can fill with lasers and or shields depending on if you want it to loiter or do a fly-past attack. But it could also have a gun turret as well to defend itself. My thought here is that this would allow you to deploy something at a longer range that could also potentially undertake patrols, and you could fill it with what you want and then you're able to control it so it doesn't rely on the code or some complex automated system. Perhaps you could fill it with the poison capsules and slowdown capsules and then use it to take out the response groups the biters send when you clear out nests with artillery. Another idea might be that you could use it to deploy fields of landmines. One of the problems with landmines at the moment is that they're a place and forget weapon. If they're used close to your walls, your bots will attempt to replace them if they're in range. This leads to an unfortunate effect where bots fly out and are destroyed by biters while trying to replace landmines, making landmine usage extremely expensive. If a drone could just be told to fly over an area, placing landmines instead, then you could essentially forget about them and just leave a nasty trap for the biters. I don't actually think we'll get this because it's a bit too complicated and involved for its own good, but we do know that Wooby has started to play about with height to implement the elevated rails. We also know that the Spidertron remote has been renamed to the RTS remote, and this feels like something that could be used like it was in a real-time strategy game. So how about something like the blimps in Command & Conquer 2? Well, I can dream. If I ever do a video about vehicles, I'll probably talk about this idea there, as I actually think it might work better as a player-driven or perhaps remote control vehicle. However, I also think it could be something that could be deployed from an equipment grid, although that could possibly just be from Spidertron, or maybe there's a variant version of Spidertron that can deploy it. More weapon and weapon effect combinations. I'm not going to dwell on this one too much, as I mentioned it in my previous science speculation video, but I think it would be kind of cool to be able to combine more of the existing and new damage effects. Some examples. Poison missiles. These would deploy poison at long range, a bit like the mortar idea from before, but perhaps easier to implement and use. Fire artillery shells. These would explode over the target, covering a large area in napalm. It'd be great for starting forest fires and those big late-game concentrations of nests. Slowdown bullets. Their damage is reduced, but each hit slows down the biter, meaning you can hit it a lot more, giving a net damage improvement, but it makes the bullets quite expensive. Discharge grenades. As the name suggests, it's like the discharge defense, but you throw it long distance like a grenade. This would be super expensive, but it's great for crowd control, pushing back biters, which could also then trigger them into different behaviours. As per my suggestion in that previous video, check it out in the link above, I'd quite like this to be randomised via research. So, each time you research it, you would gain the ability to produce one of these combined effect ammunitions, but it would be randomised. Of course, the first few would be relatively cheap, but then it quickly ramps up in cost. It would therefore be up to you if you want to keep re-rolling to try to get a specific combination of damage types, or if you just want to play with the first ones you got. I think this could add a roguelike element to combat, and therefore provide some variety, and potentially force people to play in different ways, particularly across different playthroughs. Of course, it could be that you still end up that you're OP at the end of the game, and the same basic turret solutions work regardless. But it would give some more options to those of us who want to play with different solutions each game. I think this option might also help with the problems I'm going to discuss about using the same generic solutions everywhere, and how this might not be possible for every planet. Combat by planet. I'm actually going to break the rest of this down by planet, since I think that any new weapons and new combat mechanics will all be related to the new planets they are adding. In particular, I have a strong suspicion that each planet will have at least one unique weapon class. That is, perhaps one new weapon per planet, perhaps hitting each of the main classes at least once. So this means a new gun, a new throwable, a new turret, and a new defensive system. The already revealed missile turret represents a new turret type, so we'd expect at least one throwable, one gun, and one defensive system on the other planets. Remembering, of course, that we have 4 new planets. I also think that each planet will have a unique effect associated with it. We've seen that each planet has a unique theme. Vulcanus is lava, or hot. Fulgora is lightning. Gleba is biological. And Aquilo is cold, though this is technically speculation. And I suppose there's also space, where we know we have the asteroids, which perhaps that relates to physical damage. And translating each of these into unique damage types seems to make the most sense. I also think that the enemies will be themed in a similar way, but that's for the next video. So let's start with Nauvis. Breaking with what I just said, I don't think there will actually be a new thing on Nauvis as such. I think it's more that uranium will be the Nauvis exclusive resource, so uranium related ammo will be the Nauvis exclusive thing. No changes to existing unlocks. I also don't think that the ammo, weapons and damage types that Nauvis already has will be moved to the new planets. So, for example, I don't think flamethrowers will move to Vulcanus, or poison capsules will move to Gleba. Instead, I think uranium-related ammo will be Nauvis locked, and so things like the nuclear missile can only be unlocked on Nauvis. The exception here is the artillery and the Spidertron, which we know have been moved, but they are very late game, so this does still make sense. Now, I actually think that all of the weapons and ammo will be producible on every planet. It's just that I think the new ones will all utilise a local resource. This will make it a little tricky to make them elsewhere compared to making them locally and then shipping them out. So, using uranium ammo as an example, it will make uranium ammo quite expensive to move around the system in bulk. And I think new ammo will be introduced that uses local resources and represents the local most powerful equivalent to uranium ammo. My understanding from a comment made by a dev on Discord is that currently you can't send nukes up in rockets, but they are thinking of changing this. How many you'd practically be able to send is a real question though. But even if they stay as an unshippable ammo, then sending enough uranium to another planet to make them elsewhere may also be quite tough. This is the subtle reason why I think there will be new ammo types, weapons and effects on each planet. So missile turrets might use one of the locally available materials like tungsten, holmium or carbon fibre, and this would mean that in order to build them elsewhere, you would need to ship those intermediates around. Now of course you might be doing that anyway, but also it might just be easier to send the finished turrets. But I also think that this will put subtle limits on the weapons that you can practically use on each planet, and this will force you out of simply repeating the exact same patterns everywhere. Okay, so what am I getting at? Let's have a think about Vulcanus. Let's say we want to use flamethrowers on Vulcanus. I think making the flamethrower itself will be easy enough, but to use them they require fuel to work, and this is one of the basic oil products, crude, light or heavy. While you can get some of these oil products on Vulcanus, it requires coal liquefaction. This is a more complex process to set up, and besides you may have higher priorities for your oil products. Especially since coal liquefaction requires steam and there's no easily accessible water on Vulcanus. On top of this, the fuel for a personal flamer is crude oil, and this will be completely unavailable on Vulcanus. Plus, if this is a hot world with lava-based biters, more on that on the next video, then perhaps the biters are highly resistant to flame-based damage anyway. So do you really want to go to all the trouble to set all of that up? Or will they offer you some other weapons that can be made locally, and then you've got more to do on that planet designing new defences rather than just spamming down the same solution everywhere? I think there could be similar restrictions and issues for other weapon systems that could require, at the least, complex logistics. Obviously there's nothing stopping you from doing this, but maybe instead of going to all the trouble of launching ammo from Nauvis, then flying it all the way to Vulcanus, delivering it, and then distributing it around your turrets, perhaps you could just make the local ammo. But what might that local ammo be? Tungsten bullets. In my Friday Facts and speculation videos, I've highlighted that adding a tungsten ammo would seem to be a bit redundant. It would be a bit strange to introduce tungsten ammo as being more powerful than uranium ammo, because this is a little bit unrealistic, not that realism particularly matters, but also because it's not really needed. Uranium ammo is very powerful as is. Why either introduce a better ammo, or a combo ammo that's part uranium and part tungsten and is more powerful, especially since I don't think they would nerf uranium ammo. Well, I think that my point about the logistics side of things is the answer to this. It isn't more powerful, but it is local. So it's the local equivalent of uranium ammo. Perhaps it's not quite as powerful, so there's still some reason to move uranium ammo around, but I also think it could apply an additional effect. Perhaps the obvious one, given the theme of Vulcanus, is to apply a fire damage effect. I'm sure tungsten bullets would do a physical damage still, but if they do also apply a fire effect, I imagine what we're really talking about is incendiary rounds, rather than calling them something like flaming bullets. I'm imagining this tungsten ammo as simply a new type of bullet, but I could also see a tungsten version of artillery being useful. After all, we have seen artillery trains on Vulcanus. Tungsten versions of other ammo could also be a thing. For example, tungsten cannon shells would seem to be a very obvious addition, since that's where tungsten tends to be used in real life. Lava or molten metal thrower. I'm a little unsure as to whether we'll get a lava weapon. I think molten metal is much more likely, given we can make that fairly easily using a foundry on any planet. But the problem is fundamentally, what is it adding? If it were added, I think it would apply fire type damage. This means it could be perhaps a more local version of the flamethrower turret for Vulcanus. However, if I think we get a molten metal launcher, it will instead be as an alternative fuel for the existing flamethrowers. Rather than feed them oil products, they will instead be able to launch molten metal. That will then also make it useful on multiple other planets, and it could have a significant damage buff compared to flamethrower fuel. This option wouldn't necessarily be useful on Nauvis because of how powerful flamethrower fuel already is. On Vulcanus and other planets with limited oil reserves, it could make some sense. I do also wonder if the enemies on other planets will perhaps be more vulnerable to fire damage. This would encourage you to use these turrets elsewhere in conjunction with the foundries. Of course, they could also invent a new damage type. You never know. Artillery. The Friday facts have indicated that artillery has actually been moved off of Nauvis, but it doesn't say where it's gone. Firstly, I've not really found anywhere else to put it, but also I've not really identified a new turret type that works well with Vulcanus resources, so I'm going to guess it's been moved to Vulcanus. As mentioned, we did see an artillery wagon moving about on Vulcanus, though obviously this could simply be because it's meant to be later on and the player has moved some artillery there. However, it was an interesting thing to include, given we don't know anything about the Vulcanus enemies. Fulgora. Fulgora has an interesting wrinkle in that we've been told there are no organic enemies there. However, that doesn't stop there being inorganic enemies on Fulgora, as I'll discuss in the enemies follow-up video. I mention this because no enemies might imply we'd gain no new weapons. However, we do know that lightning conductors are a thing on Fulgora, and it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to imagine the engineer might weaponize them. Lightning weapons. I think the mechanism here would be quite simple in that the weapon would shoot lightning, and this would give us a more practical weapon to do electric damage. I also think we've seen it in the Space Age logo image. But what makes it unique? I could see two possible avenues. Firstly, burst fire. This would make the weapon quite similar to the discharge defense, where they can't fire continuously, but instead fire a single big burst every so often. If this is a mechanism, then I suspect it would be a more static weapon like a turret. Let's cut to the chase. I'm talking about Factorio getting Tesla towers, like in the Command & Conquer Red Alert series. I could see deploying these around the base being a great way to deal a different type of damage. One of my overriding theories that I've hinted at about the new weapons is that to counteract the whole why bother moving stuff, there will be a rock, paper, scissors approach. By this, I mean that enemies on different planets will be more vulnerable to the specialist weapons produced on other planets. So, the Fulgoran enemies, which I suspect are defense towers, might be particularly vulnerable to the Vulcanus weapons, the Tungsten Bullets, and the Vulcanus enemies, lava biters, might be particularly vulnerable to the Gleba weapons. And then Gleba enemies, the big stompy boy, would be more vulnerable to Fulgora weapons like lightning maybe. But I'm going to go into more detail on that whole topic in the enemies video. If there is a portable version of this weapon, I wonder if it would perhaps be an equipment grid item. Perhaps we could see an overhaul of the discharge defense into a more practical defensive weapon. 2. Chaining attacks. I think the second effect could be a chaining attack. By this, I mean that you fire at one enemy and it strikes multiple additional targets, chaining between them. This could make it good for crowd control and might actually achieve what I was talking about with Launchables. For example, it could actually apply a stun effect instead of, or as well as, damaging enemies. This would then make it more of a defensive turret, which would tie in well to my theory about there being alien defensive turrets on Fulgora. A bit like the lightning conductors, the engineer basically copies and adapts these for his own use. I think a chaining attack could actually work in combination with a burst fire approach. I think giving it a very limited rate of fire makes sense, as it could be a bit ridiculous firing it at the same rate as other guns. And a chaining attack weapon could work well as a gun type, though I would wonder what the ammunition would be. If it's electricity, would it be linked to your power armor somehow? This would seem odd, as it would then require the player to use some form of power armor. Again, it could therefore be a new equipment grid item, that would then seem to have a big overlap with the personal laser turret and discharge defense. Another option here is a new grenade or capsule. Throwing electric stun grenades would be pretty cool, but as discussed, grenades and capsules become pretty redundant past the mid-game. Railgun. Another weapon option for Fulgora is the railgun. We know that EM weapons have been mentioned, and this would seem a good fit for that. So I'm going to discuss it here, but I actually think this will be a weapon unlocked on Aquilo. If you're not familiar with what a railgun is, they use electromagnetism to accelerate some form of ammunition, a pellet or something like that, to extremely high speed. While the ammunition might be small, the huge speed gives it an incredible amount of kinetic energy, and hence damage potential. Imagine being hit by a pea. Now imagine being hit by a pea travelling at 10% of the speed of light. Not fun. The reason I think it might actually be an Aquilo weapon is that the weapon could need resources from multiple planets. For example, the supercapacitor and superconductors needed to build the weapon's EM rails could be from Fulgora, but the ammunition, tungsten is ferromagnetic, could be from Vulcanus, and the material needed to build the body of the weapon could be carbon fibre, which might be a Gleba exclusive. Aquilo itself could then factor in if something like liquid hydrogen is needed to supercool the weapon. Anyway, the point is that we might get railguns. I think that this would be a high damage, slow firing weapon, and I also think it might work best as a turret. Indeed, the way I'm imagining it is as a weapon that's able to fire on mobile targets in the gap between artillery range and the range of our current turrets. I think actually the primary intention for the weapon would be for use on platforms, where they could be the equivalent of nukes suitable for destroying huge asteroids. The main challenge would be around powering them, and we've just recently heard about fusion reactors being added to the game. I have a feeling we wouldn't get a personal version of the weapon, because I'm thinking of it as being powerful but slow and heavy, so carrying it around would not be viable. I think if there was going to be a mobile version of it, other than on a platform, then it would be a vehicle-mounted option. Perhaps it would be another weapon to move around like artillery to use in a particular area for a short time. In real life, these have had test deployments at sea, as they are big, heavy weapons. One thing that does occur to me with the idea of it being a platform weapon is that it could be used for orbital bombardment. I think the platform in space could use its railgun to clear out nests in the same way as artillery, but giving you a much longer, perhaps infinite, range. I think the damage type will simply be physical, but the ammo could also explode due to the high kinetic energy, so it could well do explosive damage as well. Holmium ammo? Given the limited combat on Fulgora, I suspect that if Holmium ammo is used in ammunition at all, then it is perhaps used as part of the railgun. One possibility is for a new throwable that deals electric damage. This could, essentially, be something like a lightning grenade. It would act like the discharge defense and would tie in well with my lightning turret theory. Basically, this is going back to the idea of giving you multiple ways to use and deploy the various damage types. In this case, the throwable could use a lot of holmium, essentially turning holmium into an ammo like for tungsten on Vulcanus. Shields. I think another strong possibility for Fulgora is shields. We know that it's a great place to build circuits, and that the highest level of modules are unlocked on Fulgora. We also know that we can make supercapacitors and superconductors on Fulgora, and the theme for the planet is lightning, and therefore, by extension, controlling and manipulating electricity. Could this hint at a shield turret? As I said in the first section of the video, defensive systems are a little limited in the game, and it would be nice to see a new one being added. A shield may also give some interesting design choices for platforms. I assume they'd require a lot of power, but having a super fast platform that uses shields to bat either most of the asteroids or all of them out of the way, rather than harvest them, could be an interesting design choice. At the least, it would give us some different options instead of just placing walls everywhere. Gleba. I'll be honest, Gleba has me a little stumped for new weaponry. Other than details of the spoilage mechanic and the science pack, we've not really had any details about what the planet is actually for. There have been hints at enemies, which I'll discuss in the enemies video, but those hints don't really clue us in on what weapons the engineer might develop to deal with them, or even how the engineer might be inspired by them to make new weapons. The missile turret. I've already discussed this one at the start, so this is just a note that I think it might be a Gleba technology. I'll be honest, a big part of the reason for the guess is that I don't really know what else might be on Gleba. However, if the hint in the Friday Facts about an enemy that stomps is correct, it doesn't seem unreasonable that the engineer would develop missile turrets in response. They're a high damage, longer range weapon that, with buffs, can shoot quite quickly. With explosive rockets, and nukes I guess, they could also potentially be more effective against this big enemy, especially if it's relatively vulnerable to explosive damage. But then there's good arguments for the missile turret being unlocked on any of the intermediate planets. Vulcanus enemies might also be the best dealt with by rockets, and the defensive turrets I suspect maybe on Fulgora might be rocket turrets rather than lightning turrets. All we really know is it's on one of the intermediate planets and is quite good for dealing with asteroids. So that could even make it a space science. Viral weapons. Given that Gleba is a biological planet, and we've seen mention of both spores and spoilage in the Friday Facts, I wonder if viral weapons might be a thing. I'm thinking here mainly about a new throwable that does a new damage type. Of course, the problem with this is that it sounds very close to the poison capsule. I think the distinguishing feature might be that it spreads, making it super effective against clusters of nests and large groups of biters. As well as, or instead of a throwable, there could also be a new bioweapon variant to the artillery shell. Perhaps you can, in essence, stuff artillery shells full of spoilage, and when they knock out the nests, they also infect nearby biters, and this then does damage over time. Depending on how high your artillery range is, this virus could even wipe out biter response groups before they get to your walls. That would be quite the bonus from a bunch of waste material that you've just got lying around. However, this feels like one of those areas where I'm coming up with a mad speculation that is super complicated to implement. And to be honest, I'm not sure it would be worthwhile doing. How exactly is this really better than the poison capsules? Or even regular artillery with well-built walls? I suppose one answer could be that it would be some sort of weapon that we can deliver from space to wipe out the biters. I believe this is a thing already in space exploration, where you can deploy a planet killer virus, though I think this then comes at the cost of having to use life support all the time when on that planet. Another possibility is that, as previously discussed, it feeds into the rock, paper, scissors aspect, and is super effective against biters on other planets. Toxic sludge. A possible alternative to a viral weapon is some sort of toxic sludge cannon. I'm thinking here that this could perhaps apply acid damage and maybe poison damage as well. As we established at the start, the engineer has no way to apply the acid damage effect, and this seems like an obvious gap to fill. There's two possibilities. One is that it becomes another fuel type for flamethrowers. I'm adding quite a lot of new liquid fuels for them, aren't I? But I suspect it would most likely become a new gun for the engineer. I'm not sure why, but this just feels like something the engineer would carry around and spray onto enemies and trees directly, rather than it being used in a turret or throwable. Whether the engineer, our buildings and vehicles would be immune to the sludge, I'm not sure. I think I would prefer them not to be. It feels like there should be a highly effective, high damage gun that also has some serious friendly fire potential to make it a weapon to use carefully. We do already have a few of these, such as nukes and the explosive weapons, so it's not without precedent. As I've already noted, a lot of the weapons and effects could easily have a gun variant for the engineer to use, but I just wonder if we might get a new weapon that can only be used as a gun, like the shotgun is currently. Other than these fairly vague notions, I don't really have too many ideas for Gleba. As I say, we have so little detail about it, and what its problems and benefits are, aside from spoilage, it's been quite hard to speculate. Aquilo. Obviously, Aquilo is the final planet in Space Age where we get to finish the game and unlock the post-completion science pack for new infinite researches. If we do get new buffs, then, assuming they're infinite technologies, they could well require this post-completion science pack. After all, what's the point of having a new science pack like this if it doesn't provide us with a few boosts to the effectiveness of our weapons? Cold or freezing? We know from the Friday facts that Aquilo is definitely cold and dark. Now this could simply be a stylistic thing, or it could be used to give an atmosphere to the planet, but it would seem likely that it would also translate into a new damage type. We do, of course, have a weapon system already that can deliver liquids, so it could be yet another fuel for the flamethrower turret, but this feels a little unlikely. And I have to confess that, overall, I'm not really sure how this might fit in. The most likely option for me is a new throwable, or perhaps some variant to the landmine. If we assume that the cold effect slows down or freezes enemies in place, then it seems to overlap heavily with other weapon types. Is freezing not simply like the stun for landmines and the slowdown for capsules? What else is it bringing to the party? However, it could also be introduced as a more effective version of these, and this one really does feel like it would fit into this whole rock, paper, scissors idea I've been discussing. If a big stompy alien on Gleba needs slowing down to improve your ability to damage it, then a freeze attack would seem like a good fit. However, that would tend to push it away from being a throwable unless we also get the launcher. Similarly, if Vulcanus enemies are heat or lava based, then perhaps a freeze grenade could be a particularly effective weapon against them. A special freeze turret therefore sounds most likely if this is to be introduced to the game at all. Aquilo Railgun. I've obviously discussed the idea of the railgun in some detail already, so this is just a note that I think that Aquilo will be the actual home for this weapon, if we get it. To me it just makes perfect sense that we get an ultimate turret on the last planet that requires you to bring together a whole bunch of intermediates from all of the planets to make and use it. Plasma? Fusion bomb. We recently found out that fusion power is being introduced as a very late game power source. It wasn't definitely confirmed as an Aquilo technology, but this seems like a fairly safe bet, not least of all because it has a cooler as one of the required buildings, and Aquilo seems like the place this would be unlocked. This technology seems to have two aspects that could be weaponized. The first is plasma, which could obviously fit into all sorts of slots. A new plasma turret, a plasma gun, or plasma grenade, or even as a plasma enhancement to other weapons. It could also deliver some new damage type. But I doubt this. The reason I doubt this is that the plasma can't be passed down pipes. If we were siphoning it off to use as a weapon, surely it would either go down existing pipes or there'd be a new special pipe. No, I think what we get on Aquilo is a fusion bomb. This would essentially be an upgrade to the atom bomb we currently have and would be deployed in the same way, but would be much, much more powerful. It would take out large areas of the map, wiping out biters and clearing them for us to build on. Those huge biter patches you get far out from the origin will only require one fusion bomb, not several nukes. We already know that we need to make energy canisters to fuel our fusion plants, so using some of the ingredients to make fusion bombs doesn't seem like a big stretch. Don't get me wrong, I therefore think that fusion bombs will be very expensive and they will have a very high risk of killing yourself or your Spidertrons when using them, but it will make large-scale biter clearance much simpler. Spidertron. We've been told that the Spidertron research was moving off of Nauvis, just like we know that the missile turret is unlocked on one of the intermediate planets. Therefore, given its status as a very endgame technology, I think Spidertron will be unlocked on Aquilo too. Whether it now needs multiple materials from multiple worlds to build, I don't know, but I have my doubts, and I think it will just be built from regular stuff, so that you can build him anywhere. I think that for two reasons. Firstly, it's hugely useful for biter clearance, and making it logistically complicated to build seems like an artificial and annoying barrier that doesn't really serve any purpose. And secondly, I think it works well as a sort of player avatar for you to work remotely. It has a lot of the same functionality as the player, so sending it around to build stuff in areas where you don't yet have roboports, to me, makes a lot of sense. If you're on Gleba, how else will you be able to set up a remote outpost on Vulcanus other than with Spidertrons? And if they made them too hard to manufacture, this would kind of defeat the whole point of them. Instead, I think it will be locked on Aquilo from a technology point of view. That is, you can only research them using the new Aquilo Planet Science Pack. This is actually sort of true at the moment. It doesn't require space science, but it does require all of the other sciences. So, keeping it that you need all of the planet sciences, but not the new post-win science, keeps it thematically similar to the current unlock. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and you might consider coming back for another one. It's part of a series that I've been doing, speculating about the Space Age expansion. This one will hopefully be directly followed up by a video on potential beta changes and improvements and differences. And if you want to catch up with any of the videos in the series, there will be a playlist on the screen at the end. If you want to chat about combat mechanics, then you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel, Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Slot, Karen turret. Another weapon option, or simply like the stun.